Hmm.
Woohoo!
Last episode, we talked about 2 of the deadly sins and 2 of the corresponding heavenly virtues.
Yeah.
And I think that we both determined those were, they passed the philosophical test of leading to the good life. All right, so you up for your next sin to discuss?
Sure.
Okay. The next sin is wrath.
Wrath.
Yeah. Do you know what wrath is?
It's basically like hurting other people, right?
No, not actually.
Really?
No, it's being super angry with someone. Right? Like just super, super mad. Anger. Interesting, right?
Yeah.
What do you think its corresponding virtue is?
Forgiveness.
Right? You'd think something like that, maybe. So the one that they have, and I think this might be interesting, is patience. Right?
Yeah. Yeah, I guess so that makes sense.
You can kind of understand that a
they
little
sort
bit.
of match up.
For you, now you kind of understand, wrath as being like anger.
Yeah.
Talk to me about it a little bit.
Anger is like it's complicated because there's different ways. There's different ways of feeling it, and there's different like forms of anger almost. Like sometimes it's a minor thing, sometimes it's like a huge thing. You kind of see annoyance as like the lesser form of anger,
Yeah.
But anger in itself is just like I don't know how to explain it without like it feels like something that you just sort of know.
So first of all, you use the word feel.
Yeah.
Right? So anger is, I think we describe anger as an emotion.
Yes, it's an emotion.
Right? It's something you feel. It's not like you try to get angry.
No.
Right? Like there's no try, like, and that's kind of different in terms of a deadly sin. Right? Like, I mean,
it is.
Feeling stuff or whatever the other sins we've talked about, right? Like that's something you choose to do, right?
You could try to sort of take a step back from the emotion and be like, okay, what is the actual best response to this situation? Or you could try to have patience, like the opposite, like have more patience with the person or the situation. But in general, you cannot actually control what you feel. You can kind of control how you react to what you feel, but you can't actually control how you feel it.
Wow, I think that is a critical statement in terms of the virtues in leading the good life. We can't control what we feel necessarily, right?
No.
Like that it happens, and that's what it is. But we do have some control over our reaction to our feelings. Can you describe for me what makes you angry at someone?
Well, there are obviously a lot of different situations that you can get angry at someone at. There's a lot of different like triggers to anger. But I feel like in general, it's because in some like form or way, like not necessarily like physically or on purpose, but in some form or way, they are hurting me.
Typically, I don't think the other person's trying to make me angry.
No.
They just do.
Yeah.
So how are they hurting you if they don't mean to?
People are so different that trying to interact with someone in a way that wouldn't hurt someone else is no guarantee that it won't hurt this person.
What do you think the relationship between anger and your own expectations is?
I feel like even if you are expecting something to go wrong, when it does go wrong, you are still able to be hurt or angry. But in general, the emotions that you feel, the negative emotions that you feel, are really amplified when something happens, something bad happens, that you didn't expect at all.
Right. And I would posit that the gap between your expectations and what actually occurs affects the level of your anger.
Yeah, for sure.
So one way to have less anger would be to not expect so much from the world or other people. Would you agree with that?
I would say, yeah, that does seem like good way to sort of avoid being angry. It's sort of like expect disappointment, you'll never be disappointed. But it's also like some expectations are just literally impossible to control. Because it's like you, in general, you have just from going around the world and interacting with the world and like knowing things about the world, you automatically just have expectations that are impossible to get rid of. And you can try to control these expectations, but they're just base expectations about the world that are just a part of you and how you perceive the world. And a lot of times, those expectations are entirely reasonable. It's important to acknowledge that you could have expectations for something, and then reality did not follow those expectations, but that does not mean that those expectations were in any way unreasonable. You could expect something entirely normal from the world or someone around you, and having them feel those expectations is not a failure on your part.
I don't think the good life is going away and lowering your expectations for everything.
Yeah.
On the other hand, we've begun to see a common thread amongst all of these sins, right? And it was that common thread of self-centeredness. Let me give you the classic example for me of the self-centeredness of wrath. It's about my experience of traversing New York City. So the first 10 years I lived in New York, I was a pedestrian.
Yeah.
I walked and I took the subway everywhere. And bikes and cars made me furious.
Bikes?
Oh, bikes were the worst.
I understand cars.
Bikes would, cut you off and run you down, and they don't, they don't even follow traffic rules. And cars, of course, made me furious. And so, like the classic New Yorker thing, like stepping right out in front of a car and asserting your dominance, right? Like I did that all the time.
New Yorkers do that all the time.
Of course we do.
Very, very typical New Yorker thing.
But then, after about 10 years, I got a bike.
Not even a car, just a bike.
I got a bike. And when I was biking,
oh my god, the pedestrians.
The pedestrians made me insane. Well, so then we had the kids, right? And so we eventually got a car.
Yeah.
So we could kind of get out of the city occasionally. Guess what I felt when I was driving my car in New York City? Bikes and pedestrians. They were the problem. I think a good way to think about the way that expectations and the self-centeredness affect anger and wrath is when I was a pedestrian, bikes and cars made me angry. When I was on a bike, cars and pedestrians made me angry. And when I was driving, pedestrians and bikes made me angry.
Yeah.
And the answer, of course, is who's the asshole in that situation? Me. I am, right? Because it's not them being the problem, I'm the problem.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the opposite of wrath, at least in our classical virtue edition.
Patience.
Patience. So talk to me a little bit about patience.
I feel like in the definition, it is like waiting for something. Like being able to wait. Because it's like, oh, people always tell you like, oh, be patient, this thing will happen eventually. But it seems, and especially in like the context of wrath, like it's not just that. It's more like accepting not that these things will come eventually, but that these things might not come.
I think that's totally right. I think that in the modern definition, we think of patience as being time-based. I think in the classical definition of patience, they're talking about expectations-based.
Patience is just recognizing your emotions and deciding on your course of action without letting those emotions control you.
To me, that definition sounds a little bit too much like controlling your emotions, which I think is a little bit of a dangerous thing.
Yeah.
Right? Sitting and lording over your emotions, like that's hard, one. And two, it can be repressive.
Yeah, no.
What do you think the relationship between patience and stepping outside of yourself or your perspective is? Sorry.
For your dumb little road rage thing where you are constantly angry at literally everyone else besides yourself, stepping outside of yourself, of your car, of your bike, of your, legs, would have been a good way to not just be so constantly angry at literally everything, and like to not intentionally, in the pedestrians at least, to not intentionally try to piss everyone off.
So I like that description of that. And so in that example, think about how my perspective changed as I had more experiences and more diverse experiences.
Yeah.
I think we've pretty well covered that pair of virtues and vices.
Are we not going to discuss whether or not they fit into the good life?
What do you think? Are those real or are those made up virtues?
I think that patience is definitely a real virtue, but I think for wrath, it's not necessarily always a bad thing, because there is justified anger.
If you are justified in your emotional reaction, and it's not because you just have this selfish perspective, then I don't even think that counts as wrath. But if it's based on your expectations being unreasonable, then clearly you are in the wrong.
Yeah.
This next pair, I think, is another weird pairing on first sight. The deadly sin is envy.
Oh, envy, yeah.
Describe envy for me.
So you have this person. This person has something, and you're like, I want that something. And so in your little head, it's like, before that person had it something, it was either like you didn't even realize that someone could have that something, or now it's closer to you, so it seems somehow more attainable. You like assign a false amount of blame onto this person when literally the only thing they've done is had the thing.
I think that's a really important point. And notice once again how it comes back to
self-centeredness
and your expectations.
Yeah.
In New York City, if you have a $500,000 apartment, no one's envious of you, because that's
typical.
That's or the low end of an apartment that you can buy in New York City that could even hold a family. But if someone here in Belize had a $500,000 US home, do you think that would provoke envy?
Well, number one, it would be way, way nicer than any of the apartments. But yeah, number two, not a lot of people here have a $500,000 house, so that would be a cause for like a lot of envy.
So once again, what you said was correct, right? That it's based on your expectations, and those expectations change based on those people immediately around you.
Yeah.
So that's what the corresponding heavenly virtue of envy is.
I have no clue.
No clue, right?
No.
Kindness.
What?
Right? I told you it was gonna be a weird one.
Yeah, that is a weird one.
Well, so let's see if these guys are crazy. Right? Let's unpack it a little bit. What's kindness? Can you remember a moment that you were kind?
Well, I don't think this is like this huge monumental display of kindness. Like I don't think it's like a big thing that I did, but like comforted someone while they cried.
Typically, you can show kindness when someone is suffering or beneath you in some way.
I guess.
So the first part of kindness is that, there's a sense of that you are attending to someone who is hurt or in a lower position to you. And secondly, that you take some proactive action.
Yeah.
Right? To alleviate another person's pain.
Yeah. Well, I feel like there would also be, I don't know, like you would say like getting someone a gift or something could be like a kind action, and that's not necessarily like making their pain better. It's just like doing something nice.
Then let's put a finer point on this. Kindness is putting someone else's needs above your own.
That kind of seems exactly like selflessness.
Are you beginning to see a trend in these virtues and vices?
Well, it's like selfishness, like being self-centered, so being like, oh, I'm the very most important person in my own world above anyone else, is just, it feels like everything else kind of stems off of that.
And the interesting thing that we started with here is that from a philosophical perspective,
being self-centered is like the worst thing you can be.
It's the worst thing you can do. So there's almost like this connection between truth and virtue in the philosophical sense?
I mean, like, I feel like truth would not always be the number one priority outside of a philosophical sense.
Talk to me about what you're saying.
Outside of philosophy, well, honesty is always like a great policy, but in some cases, like white lies, like lying can be better than telling the truth.
So, listen, I will acknowledge that truth-seeking is clearly a philosophical act.
Yes.
And that for human beings, truth-seeking isn't necessarily the end-all, be-all. But by unpacking these various virtues and their corresponding sins, we're doing is we're beginning to understand that truth just isn't a matter of your intellectual understanding of the world. That it actually affects your life. So talk to me about that a little more. Like, how people kind of feel like, not not understanding the truth or not caring about the truth or whatever is sort of like an intellectual failure, but not a moral failure.
By not knowing the truth or not seeking out the truth or not acknowledging that a lot of the things you know are probably not true, you are not capable of fully, truly interacting with the world.
But you're also going to make yourself and others less happy.
Yeah.
Right? So when we talk about pride and humility, if I have this self-centered base of the universe and it only matters what I think about it, well, that's not, as we've discussed before, that's not going to work. So now that we kind of understand the connection between truth and virtue, sorry, we literally have ash all over us right now.
It's fine.
Okay. Now that we've discussed the connection between truth and virtue, talk to me about how envy is a misunderstanding of the world and a self-centered view of the world.
Envy is entirely dependent on your expectations. Because the reason you're feeling envy is because you feel like you should have something that you don't and that someone else has. And you feel that by having this thing, it's almost like this person is stopping you from having the thing or mocking you from having the thing, mocking you for not having the thing, when really all they're doing is possessing this thing that you want.
Right, they just exist.
All they're doing, envy is so self-centered because you are making yourself this whole narrative in your head where you are the victim and this other person is the villain, somehow keeping you from this thing, mocking you about not having this thing, when really all they are doing is existing, and you can't handle that.
Well, so I think we've covered a couple virtues for today. We're about out of time.
Yeah.
I think we've reestablished that these virtues aren't just something that's made up.
Yeah.
Right? That there's a connection, a deep intrinsic connection between living the good life and the philosophical project.
Yeah.
So we'll continue this series next week and talk about a couple more and see if this continues.
Yep.
All right. So, interesting discussion on wrath and envy.
Yeah.
Ultimately, I guess we felt like those were
real,
right? To be avoided. To lead the good life.
Do not commit those deadly sins.
Okay, good. So next week we're going to talk about
lust.
Lust. Just what every dad wants to talk about with his daughter.
Yeah.
Right? So definitely tune in for that one. Next week?
Next Friday, come here for lust. Don't forget to like and subscribe.
Like and subscribe.